Talking to you about is work that I've done formally with an organisation called the Khalid bin Sultan Living Oceans Foundation in the States, and then also Nova Southeastern University. We're dealing here with a coral reef seascape, and I've just sort of thrown up this picture just to kind of give you an expectation of what we might be dealing with in the Society Islands. We have, in this case, an uplifted high island, so you can see some sort of upland vegetation areas. We have a lot of coastal development. We may have inland lagoons, and then surrounding these islands, reefs, sediment systems, and if we're talking ecosystem services, you can see very much here shoreline protection formed by these reefs is incredibly important. For the uninitiated, where are the Society Islands? Well, they're part of the French Polynesia archipelago, which is out there in the middle of the Pacific, and you get these islands that may range from a few kilometers across to sort of 30, 40, 50 kilometers, but they can be quite spread out in terms of large areas of ocean between them. In Richard's talk earlier on, he threw up a slide when we were talking about biodiversity hotspots. Of course, the one that he threw up was a coral reef. Often we talk about the rainforests of the sea when we talk about coral reefs. But there's other ways of sort of thinking about this, and actually if we think about sort of social and economic dependence on ecosystems, in a lot of areas, sort of small islands in particular, and this came up in a talk yesterday, a lot of these areas are incredibly dependent on the reef resource around them. So the Society Islands fall into this category from the work of Burke et al. Of being very high in terms of the social and economic dependence. So the motivation behind a lot of my work really is developing spatial data to help understand some of the points of vulnerability and resilience for coral reef systems. And this is sort of part of a much larger project from the Living Oceans Foundation, spanning various sites across the globe. In every site that the Living Oceans Foundation works, or I should say most of the sites, one of the things they aim to do is produce these environmental audits, and there was some very good talks yesterday and today about habitat mapping. For me, this is quite a critical component actually for the seascape, actually knowing what's on the seafloor, whether that's coastal, offshore, wherever we're dealing, is quite important. And then the various zonations, depth being an important one. And actually working in coral reef areas, because of the quality of the water that you have in a reef area, you can do things mapping wise that you perhaps can't do in a temperate area. So we're sort of transitioning in a lot of ways from terrestrial mapping technologies into the shallow marine environment here. So we can do a lot of object-based mapping, and there was a good talk on that yesterday. And a lot of this is now freely available, and you can explore it at this link that you'll see down the bottom here. I'm going to focus today a little bit more on some of the threats to reef systems, talking perhaps a little generally, but these can range from things that are very much sort of global in scope, related to climate change and so forth, to things that are very local to that particular area. So for example, in French Polynesia, the sort of standout ones, there are others and there are nuances within what you see here, but there are sort of thermal bleaching events. So coral bleaching is a situation where if we have elevated temperatures, that might exceed the threshold that a coral can normally live in, and then you might get these bleaching events where the skeleton becomes obvious, where the coral exudes its symbiotic algae, which is what gives it its colour. It takes on this bright white appearance. Issues of fishing pressure on reefs. In certain regions, we may have concerns of land-based runoff. Cyclones are an ever-present concern, causing great physical damage when they come through. And then there's a sort of biological story with the Crown-of-Thorns Starfish, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. These are all sort of connected issues, really. It's quite hard to separate them out, but I'm going to sort of do my best to deal with some of them in separate ways. So I'm just going to deal with a few of them, but just to give an example here. So once we've done some of this detailed mapping, if we know something from the field about which depths, for example, and which habitats are particularly susceptible to bleaching events, we can then start to develop some spatial or map-based indices of where we would expect these threats to impact. So this is an example for one of the islands of Society Island, Taha Raiatea, taking data actually from nearby Moorea and mapping out the depths and habitats at risk. Another important question when it comes to thermal stress on the reef is differences in temperature, I guess. It's quite obvious. So here what we're doing is we're taking a long-term data set. So this is the Pathfinder AVHR data set and mapping out a 30-year climatology and then trying to develop quite fine resolution mapping index of where we expect to see thermal stress occurring. So here we're mapping out the degree heating days index. And actually 1998, which was quite a bad year for coral reefs around the world in a lot of areas, it was an El Nino year, turns out to have not been too big an issue in French Polynesia, but actually 2002 was a much bigger concern. And then you'll also see the spatial variation between different sites within French Polynesia. Now, I sort of debated about how to sort of attack this talk a little bit and where to focus. I've decided to focus on this story of the Crown-of-Thorns Starfish. It's a bit of a sort of case study for a lot of the themes which seem to keep coming up. And when I think of Seascapes, to me a lot of what it talks about is multidisciplinary thinking and also interaction between land and sea processes. So I'm going to work through a bit of a story here with this Crown-of-Thorns Starfish. Now the Crown-of-Thorns is a voracious predator of coral. As you can see, this is a picture of a Crown-of-Thorns here. You can see why it gets its name. It has these big spikes that look like thorns and are very painful if you happen to stand on one. And when you get an outbreak of these starfish, you can get thousands of individuals. So you can quickly go from a situation, as you see in this top picture here, and this is data from Kayal et al., where we have a fairly healthy reef, and